Welcome back to World War I. This lecture will focus on peace after the war. It is the final lecture in the World War I series. Just a reminder from the last lecture. On November 3rd, 1918, sailors and Marines from the German Navy refused to fight. 6 days later, the people of Berlin rose up in rebellion, and the Kaiser abdicated. At this point, without a German government in place, at the 11th hour, on the 11th day of the 11th month, a ceasefire will end the war. So what to do now? The focus is on the war's cost. But when we talk about the war's cost, we're not talking about financial cost, though it was great. We're talking about the amount of casualties that came from this trench warfare, chemical warfare, and mechanized warfare. So if we look at these numbers, 5 million Allied troops were dead, 8 million Central Powers troops were killed, and 6.5 million civilians were killed. Remember, 750,000 of those were Germans who died of starvation. Americans lost 50,000 lives, but there was only 1 year of fighting for the Americans, and those numbers are added into the Allied troops. So the big conversation amongst people at the Paris Peace Conference, which will result in the Treaty of Versailles, is how do we make the war's cost, these costs, worthwhile? Wilson felt that he had a plan, and that was his 14 points. Points 1 through 5 were issues that caused the war and should be changed, such as freedom of the seas, reducing arms, and adjusting colonial claims. 6 through 13 were specific boundary changes, like giving back Russian territory, breaking up the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Ottoman Empire, and establishing the nation of Poland. But the 14th point, which he considered the most important point of all, was the League of Nations. And the League of Nations would be a collective organization for nations to work out their disagreements in a diplomatic and political way rather than taking up arms. The Treaty of Versailles is how all of these items get brought together. It established 9 new nations, such as Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, recognized the fact that Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia came from the Austro-Hungarian Empire. It carved out 4 areas of the Ottoman Empire and gave them to Britain and France to govern until these countries were ready for self-government. These were Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Palestine. But the biggest problem with the Treaty of Versailles was what it did to Germany. See, the people at the Paris Peace Conference really felt that Germany was at fault for this war. And so the first thing they wanted to do was demilitarize Germany. They weren't allowed to have a military or take up arms. Also, they wanted Germany to pay for the war. So they forced them to pay reparations and also to sign a war guilt clause, acknowledging that it was responsible for the war. The biggest weaknesses of the Treaty of Versailles was it humiliated Germany. It ignored Russia. They weren't even welcome at the peace table. And it created instability from removing colonial territories. When the Ottoman Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire are broken up, it creates a lot of instability in those areas. When a treaty comes to the United States, there's a lot of debate over the League of Nations. They were worried about becoming more entangled in European affairs, especially Article 10 of the League of Nations Charter, which said that they would act in mutual defense. So an attack against one nation could result in the United States being forced to respond to protect them, even against the consent of the Congress. Congress is the only one who can declare war. Presidents ask for a declaration of war, but they can't declare it. So thus, if the U.S. gets brought into war without the consent of Congress, this is actually unconstitutional. Senate would not approve the treaty. Those with reservations were led by Henry Cabot Lodge. His picture is over to the right. Wilson tried to appeal to the people. He tried to convince the American people to offer their support not only for the Treaty of Versailles, but also for the League of Nations. He really felt that if he could convince the American people that they should support this treaty, they would contact their senators to support it, and it would be voted in. Wilson believed that world peace could not be achieved without the League of Nations. Unfortunately, after 32 stops on a railroad campaign going around the nation to convince the people, Wilson will suffer a debilitating stroke and will not be able to finish. So peace will come with a separate treaty in 1921. The U.S. will never join the League of Nations, will be an unofficial observer. The irony of the entire situation is most senators and most Americans didn't want to remain completely isolationist. We just differed on what participation in world affairs would look like. Should we be acting on mutual defense? Should we be part of a negotiating committee? Or should we simply be part of the conversation without having to take any action? And this is where the breakdown comes in. We will see the results of this Treaty of Versailles and the humiliation of Germany come to a head in the 1930s. But in the meantime, we'll be focusing on the Roaring Twenties and the boom of industry and culture that comes with it.